You're listening to Dakota Spotlight. My name is James Wallner. This is Season 10, You Killed Chris. You're listening to Episode 6. In this episode, you will hear a conversation made over 10 years ago with Niels Jorgensen, the man Linda Schulkel believes killed her friend Christine Rothschild. That and more coming up in this, Episode 6 of You Killed Chris.
It seems now more certain than ever that the bloody experience of Vietnam is to end in a stalemate.
Law and order have broken down in Detroit, Michigan.
Martin Luther King was shot and was killed tonight in Memphis.
There it was, Christine Rothschild, murdered on campus.
Yeah, I remember Christine, and I've always wondered, who for sure actually killed her.
She says, I think he followed me from by Memorial Union.
In this season, we have learned a lot about Linda Schulkel and her relentless pursuit of the truth about what happened to her friend Christine Rothschild in 1968. It's a quest she has pursued for decades, and as we have learned, her journey led her to a man named Niels Jorgensen, the resident surgeon who spent just weeks in Madison, Wisconsin, before promptly leaving town after Christine's murder. Linda is convinced that Niels is responsible for Christine's murder, and she is in no way alone in that belief. In fact, almost everyone we spoke to for this story had the same two things to share with us. Number one, they expressed great praise for Linda's work on this case. And number two, they feel that Linda's theory is most likely the correct one. Niels Jorgensen killed Christine Rothschild. And that they acknowledge is something that may never be able to be proven. Here is Sarah Surratt again. In 1967 and 68, Sarah lived just down the hall from Christine at Anne Emery Hall.
I have talked to Linda many times over the phone, over email, and yes, she is absolutely amazing. I just could not believe how relentless she has been in trying to get justice for Christine. I think Linda solved the case beautifully, with poetic justice.
And you will recall Dick Josephson, the now retired detective who investigated the Rothschild case, including taking a trip in 1968 to New York City to interview Niels Jorgensen.
You've talked to Linda, I'm sure. Yeah, and she's pretty sure it was Jorgensen, but my job as captain of detectives was proof. And I can't say he did or he didn't because I don't have any proof.
Perhaps you also remember Dr. Lou Bernhardt. He was working at the University Hospital in 1968, and he has recollections of Niels Jorgensen. Here are some thoughts he shared with Mari Zoerb Hansen, assistant researcher on this series, when she met with him at his home.
Somewhere in the 51 years that Linda devoted her life to solving this crime, she contacted me. And we began a friendship of trying to put pieces together like you're doing for the podcast. And I gave her, in any way I could, I helped her so that she could solve this crime. Because if you read the book, the different police agencies kind of shuttled it around. And if it hadn't been for Linda, this crime would never have been solved. Now, I don't know if, quote, it's still an open case. I don't say that in a legal, but it clearly, he was the murderer.
And I have my opinions about it, but in your opinion, why did the police, as you said, sort of shuttle it around in the way that they did?
I have no idea.
Yeah.
I have no idea. And every time Linda tried to, she was kind of shuttled around like don't bother us. We got more things to do. Policing has come a long way also. Transparency in our world is much more. Accountability has progressed as time has progressed. People are held more accountable today.
Well, and would you also say that the process for screening residents is probably more complete than it used to be?
No question about it. No, I mean, no, there's no question about it. I mean, I don't know how Sandy quote vetted him, because Sandy is one of the most upright, honest, integrity without a blemish. He's just a fine gentleman.
And there are others who are in awe of Linda's efforts. Anna Hansen is a young reporter at the Wisconsin State Journal in Madison. She's been researching the Christine Rothschild case for some time now.
I mean, you mentioned Linda. She has been just such an incredible source, and being so willing to share all of her efforts into this case. Like, I can't stress enough how incredible she is.
When I spoke with Anna recently, she mentioned something that will be helpful to understand in a moment when we meet yet another woman who has attempted to help solve this case. And that is that there was speculation over the years that a serial killer may have been in the Madison area, and some people speculated further that Christine may have been the killer's first victim. Here is Anna Hansen again, reporter at Wisconsin State Journal.
I don't personally subscribe to this belief, but, it's worth noting that people thought that there might be a serial killer in Madison because Christine was killed. And after that, throughout the 70s and into the 80s, a number of young female students were murdered on and around campus.
And it was partially because of those theories about a serial killer that another young woman got involved in this case back in 2011.
Despite how painful and bleak elements of this story are, I don't know, there's something really beautiful about how dedicated Linda has been to the memory of her friend.
This is Jill Clare. I spoke with her recently because years ago, in 2011, she had one long telephone conversation with Niels Jorgensen. It's a conversation you're about to hear. Jill lives in London. No, not that London.
London, Ontario, Canada. I have been here since 2008, moved here for school and fell in love with the city and just kind of never left. I have a undergraduate degree in information and media studies, and I have a master's degree in library and information science.
Jill is also the vocalist in a punk rock band. Here is a snippet of one of their songs, Arguing with Strangers on the Internet.
Arguing with strangers on the internet, not going out today because I'm feeling too upset. Arguing with strangers on the internet, and I'm winning.
During her third year of undergraduate studies, Jill was drawn to a course on campus called Serial Killers in the Media.
And the purpose was specifically introducing non-criminology students to styles of investigation, reviewing primary sources.
And Jill thought that sounds really interesting. So she signed up for the class.
The culminating activity for that was looking at an old cold case and seeing if you could come to a different conclusion than the investigators who worked on the case. And sort of the theme running out throughout the course was the perception of serial killers, especially from the, let's say, the 60s to the 90s, as public enemy number one created this kind of hysteria. So a lot of the time people would be like, oh, this is the work of a serial killer, when sometimes it was, but a lot of the time it was just, very tragic homicides that, because of this hysteria, people created this myth and linked deaths together, which was, what I would argue happened at the University of Wisconsin at Madison.
The project was a group assignment. Jill's group looked into several murders, one of them being Christine Rothschild. And even though this was before Linda Schulkel had written her book, it didn't take long for their research to lead them to Linda.
The most pivotal moment of this assignment for me, it wasn't interviewing Jorgensen. It was definitely getting in touch with Linda Shulko. Stroke of luck, just happened to find an email address she was still using. So got in touch with her, and she was initially like thrilled.
And of course Linda was thrilled. I think we all know enough about Linda's quest at this point to understand that she would be overjoyed that someone, anyone other than herself, was interested in Christine's case. But what Jill did not understand about Linda at that time was the incredible extent of research, the sheer volume of work Linda had put together. I mean, knowing what we know now about Linda, imagine calling her up on the phone and saying something like, "Hey, can you send me what you have on Christine's case and this Niels Jorgensen guy?"
She was like, just given the deadline you have, like, there's too much work that I've created to be able to like send it along, and so that was almost the end of that.
But then, as Jill probed more into what Linda knew about Jorgensen, this happened.
And then she was like, well, I have his number if you want to call him. And I was like, yeah, you know what? I would like to call him. I was able to kind of bring this to the group and be like, what do you think? What do you want to do about this? And they were like, yeah, if you want to contact that guy, you should probably follow this lead.
So Jill started preparing for her call to Niels Jorgensen. She didn't want to give Jorgensen her actual name and identity, so she came up with a plan and created for herself a type of false identity. She would tell Jorgensen her name was Martha Shepard and that she was a student at the University of Michigan. She chose the University of Michigan only because she had a cousin there, and she felt she could probably pull off a cover story like that.
I just knew some very basic details about the school, just to kind of lend some credibility to this fake character that I had created. I remember going home one afternoon, it was the winter time, and knowing I was going to have to make the call, I had my list of questions. I think I wrote out 8 to 10 questions to ask him.
Jill also took steps to mask her phone number because she didn't want him to have it. In fact, she wasn't even 100% certain she wanted Niels Jorgensen to answer the phone at all.
I was kind of hoping, I was really divided. I was like, if he doesn't answer, am I going to have to call him again? Or is it good enough that I've tried? Also, was interested in talking to him in some way, just because, how often do you pointedly, as a civilian, get to ask a suspected killer if they've murdered someone?
But Jorgensen did answer the phone.
The most stress I have ever had going in a conversation ever, even to this day. And the fact that he was home and that he picked up and that he was more than willing to talk to me, I think I might have been in a very mild form of shock. But, I really like Linda. I really like the person who's kept eyes on this case for, over 50 years. She did a very good job, I think, too, of prepping me for what I was in for. She was like, he's nuts,
And Jill says the preparation Linda gave her helped. Jill was satisfied with herself on how she handled the conversation.
You surprise yourself when you kind of put yourself in those unfamiliar situations, when you really go outside of your comfort zone and talk to a narcissist on the phone.
Jill did record her conversation with Jorgensen, but unfortunately, she's unable to locate the original today. However, back in 2011, before the recording went lost and as part of her class assignment, she transcribed it very carefully. Now, naturally, I wanted to turn that surviving transcript into something you could listen to on this podcast. And I had a few options on how to go about it. I could read the transcript myself, I could hire voice actors, or I could use a synthetic voice. In the end, the synthetic option actually felt like the best choice, mainly because we have no recorded examples of Niels' voice. Recreating an accurate sense of him would be impossible. In my opinion, then, a synthetic representation is the most appropriate way of handling it. Sure, it sounds artificial and it's far from perfect, but I like the transparency of it. There should be no mistaking that this is not the actual voices of Jill and Niels Jorgensen. Now, before we dive into this conversation, I need to say this. In this interview, Niels Jorgensen is all over the place. You might call him unhinged. He rambles, shares random negative views on socialism, on women in general, brags about his wartime accomplishments, which, as far as we know, are lies. He even gets into disparaging Bill and Hillary Clinton and talks about hippie twin nurses. As I said, he's a bit all over the place. I suggest that as you listen to this conversation, try not to feel too distracted or frustrated if you can't quite follow along with what he's saying all the time, because that is the reality of it. You should be confused because he is confusing. I did consider editing out portions of the conversation, but in the end, I think many of you will be fascinated by this. That said, if you've simply had enough of Niels Jorgensen at some point and want to scroll forward in this episode, the conversation ends at about the 47-minute mark. Anyway, without further ado, let's listen in on this recreated 2011 conversation between Jill Clare and Niels Jorgensen.
Hi there. I was hoping to speak with Niels Jorgensen this afternoon.
Who's calling?
My name is Martha Shepard. I'm a student at the University of Michigan.
Yes?
I am doing a project on the Capital City murders, and I was wondering if you wouldn't mind answering a couple questions for me to help me with my project.
Capital City murders? Is this someone shooting students from a tower or something? Or what?
Well, the Capital City murders were a couple of deaths which occurred to young women on the University of Wisconsin at Madison between, I think it was like 1965 to like 1987, something like that.
I was there briefly to get a chance to be chief survey resident, but I left because the politics at that school were so rotten that I left and got my chief residency somewhere else.
Okay, I
didn't get to socialize much. I was very busy, and I had some really, really big personal problems among the big professors. I really didn't get to know the students. The people I got to know were graduate students, and that's about it.
I understand that you are suspect in one of these
That's because of a jealous, well, not jealous, I'll say invective surgery chief who I exposed to be negligent in his duties. I had a patient which I was watching with the chest surgery chiefs, and I called him to let him know that the patient's blood pressure was dropping, and his systolic pressure was falling below numerically. That's the pulse rate. Oxford's rule of shock, ma'am, was an intern oxygen at Children's Hospital in New Orleans. And I notified this guy, and he was miffed that I bothered him at a party. Well, guess what? The next day, the diagnosis was of this patient. Rigor mortis. And I embarrassed that son of a bitch, Smart Alec. And he took upon himself, who didn't know anything about student affairs, even less than I, and dropped my name as a suspect. And that was just particularly vindictive, as I exposed him as an arrogant son of a bitch, who I exposed him for what he was, whereas I did my duty and informed him.
How come you've never cleared your name then?
I didn't have to clear my name. I did have an FBI because I have certain connections when I was Sergeant Major of Air Force Headquarters. That's how I cleared my name, because I was actually with a couple of student nurses who came over to see me and took me back to their abode, and I made an illegal turn in an illegal park. I went straight down the street to their place, dropped them off, made an illegal U-turn, came back to my place, and I was in no way there, and I wasn't. My name was cleared, but it was Federal Bureau of Investigation, and I was involved in some other things, namely espionage overseas, and I was making reports as a medical missionary to the CIA. So this is a matter that embarrassed the idiots off the socialist and the socialist mind on campus who seemed to think that Christian missionaries were like Elmer Gantry, hypocrites. Whereas the hypocrites are the socialist alias communist in the student body, which had taken over some of our best colleges in the country, Harvard, Yale, UCLA, and Stanford and Berkeley. And that's under the dominant theory of education, which took place in the 1890s in this country. And we have some of our own worst enemies right among us. The socialists masquerading as Democrats.
Were you familiar with Christine Rothschild at all? Did you have any relationship with her?
I never met her. I might have seen her. She might have made a spectacle of herself at the restaurant across the street from the university. We heard about her. I didn't even know her name until some years later. And in fact, we have some obsessive-compulsive neurosis on the part of somebody else who really made it a career, even sent me a DVD delineating that there was in this Rothschild person's home area a serial killer. She seemed to have forgotten a little about that. Furthermore, If she wanted to go into it, I never even dated teenage girls when I was in high school because I found something much better. One of my track associates in our 5 high school, he introduced me to his cousin Amalia in San Fernando, who was 19 years of age. I was only 15, shot up tall for a 15-year-old. She was such a wonderful girl that a lot of the girls who wanted to date me too, I said, I'm sorry, I've got somebody else. So I never even dated any high school girls because I found older women and I found them much more valuable. So the thought that I would even date these teenagers, which I've never done, that's ridiculous. They would bore the hell out of me. And I had no time for them, and I was very busy. The surgery department was mismanaged, and you can imagine how it went. Through the surgery department with Dr. Hickey was thusly addressed by his surgery resident, that his chief surgery resident, Marvin Steinbeck, I think his name was. But Marvin, why didn't you stop me? But Dr. Hickey, I thought you knew what you were doing. This conversation had been rickety-rocketing all over the campus, and it wasn't too long after that that Dr. Hickey had to resign, and Dr. Curary, who was my surgical medical team, took over as chief surgery and chief professor. How do you like that for some interesting stuff that was going on?
That is pretty interesting.
Yeah, and then we have also Dr. Quack, who was the second chief of chest surgery, he didn't even speak to the real chief, the head chief chest surgeon, the one that spoke my name, because I exposed him as being an arrogant little neglecter of duty who cost a patient his life because he should have had a transfusion. And I notified him in good time the night before when his blood pressure was dropping and his pulse was rising according to Oxford's rule of shock. So I was a political inconvenience. I did my job, and he did not. And now you have some insider politics. However, Senator of Sam Hayek College, professor at the University of California, and a senator of California, and he said, come back to academic politics. What we thought were politics, but there was only one. And if there are any group of politics which were even worse, is church politics, because you expect to learn much more about them. So how do you like them apples?
How do you feel about the way these cases were handled?
The small-town cop mentality played to their political advantage to some of the professors at the University of Michigan. And I think that it's just sort of pathetic that these little cops are trying to have a job which is far beyond them, and then cooperating with others who are satisfied with some gritty explanation which didn't demand much mental activity.
I see. So you were pretty dissatisfied with the way this case was handled? Maybe
I was looking
with,
for to get a chief surgery residency so I could go back into the missionary field with better credentials, having finished the chief residency, because priests can be pretty snotty. And MRCS, Military Royal College Surgeons, I had an associate in Zululand, Dr. Anthony Barker, really a wonderful man. And I was going to come back to the mission field in Africa, but I got distracted by the mission field in the ghetto in Brooklyn. And I was at the call committee of the Diametic Society Consultant on Tropical Medicine. I didn't even know who this Christine Rothschild, but I did know some of the Rothschild family in Berkeley in the University of California. We used to go flying with Bertram Rothschild off the Rothschild family, South Africa. In fact, his father had preceded the stock exchange in Johannesburg. And when I was in Africa, I was with him. I was a guest at his home in Pretoria. I don't know if they knew the branches of the family, if this was even the same family, if this, what do you call her? Christine Rothschild.
That's right.
I didn't associate with undergraduates. I did socialize a bit at restaurants and bars and things with the professors and the graduate students. And I went to a few parties now and then. You know, when you're on every other night, you don't have a hell of a lot off time.
Absolutely.
And then there was this very hostile competition to get chief surgery residency, but about as popular as Leonard Field's Hannesteeth. Find something like that at a good university, you know. It will give you good credentials. You can finish up. As a matter of fact, there was even some doubt about University of Michigan. They had nationally a good reputation, except they had very severe problems intramurally. You can look up some interesting stuff there on this DVD that this little lady she's really an obsessive-compulsive neurosis, and it's a shame that she put so much of her life on a much false trail set out by this vindictive professor who I exposed for not doing his job, and I just did my job. Let him, the patient was in serious threat, and he did nothing.
Do you know the name of this obsessive-compulsive woman?
What are you saying? Look, I have artillery damage from artillery during World War II, and I don't hear everything very well. What did you say?
I apologize. Do you know the name of this obsessive-compulsive woman who's been keeping in contact with you?
Yes, I could have her prosecuted for harassment in the mail, but I didn't. Just hold on. Ms. Linda Schulko. She's a pathetic individual who wasted a lot of her time and possibly a lot of the truth, multiple serial killers, followed by misdirecting efforts which exactly which I can't say it was the campus police, which I can't say, or the Madison police either. Small-town cops. Not to cast dispersion on small-town cops, they don't have nearly the situation or the expertise that they do in New York or in Los Angeles. As a matter of fact, I've been a consultant to the Superior Court in California, in Los Angeles County, for victims of violent crime.
I
Saul
see.
gave you Miss Shulko. She's a rather pitiable situation, which she developed through neurosis there, which has given her a lot of wasted time and misdirection. And I'm just about the last person who would be involved. The only students I had anything to do with was one very fine young lady who was a philosophy major, and she kept writing me for some time, but I'm afraid I lost track of her. Her name was Ayamara Krasts. I think it's a Slavic name, or Yugoslavia, or Latvia, or Lithuania, or one of those countries. When I heard that some student was damaged, I was worried about Ayamara because she took long bicycle rides at night and was always meticulously dressed in white trousers and jacket and everything. And she wrote me these long letters telling me about her philosophical problems. She had very neat penmanship. I don't know what the potential might have been of this Christine person, but she's a person I never met, and I've never met this Linda Shulko.
Oh, I see. Well,
Is this a name that, are you familiar with this person?
I think I've seen Miss Shulko's name a couple times.
I beg your pardon? What did you say?
I think I've come across her name a couple times just while I was researching the victims for the Capital City case.
Spoke with several victims? Otherwise, was this the serial killer thing that was an adjacent caddy from which Miss Rothschild had come originally?
That's right. She's supposedly one of the victims of this serial killer who was active in Madison from 65 to 87.
Well, there was something on the DVD, a referral to a serial killer in a different county. Adjacent county, I guess it was. And they took about several victims, but I only heard about this one person who was a similar name to my friend from Berkeley, the real Rothschild family, the international financiers. Interesting thing came about from one of my friends who was on a visit from Stanford to make movies out of popular people like the State Department and the Saudis and Arabian. Political movies. Dustin Honquest came to this country in 1830, bought a ranch, and there's a big air base up there named Lantequet. And when his father was in the Air Force as a colonel, he had about 200 replacements go through his unit. A fighter pilot hands you over to North Africa. And this school he was with, it was a country school hestered by a French cavalry officer. Of course, this was after the war had concluded, but interesting school. But he met some of the people who ran France and have for the last 1,000 years, and he built a group of so-called because of a hotel he went into. It's actually been the only strengths for money boys in the world for many years. In China, they're known as the Zhang Pei. Now, I had a girlfriend who I met at a penthouse party in New York, Zoe Chan of the Chan clan. The Chan clan was very active with the old ambassador of the old Tia Pen. Said he was like a big judge for solving family problems in the New York area. That makes the mafia look like tiddlywinks. They have international power you wouldn't believe. Anyway, I think came up that why did Napoleon lose as Waterloo? Well, it just so happened that Manso Ho Shi, who was in charge of the northern corridor at the Waterloo site, failed to enter the fray from the north. And that was after Manso Ho Shi had received a carrier pigeon from the northwest, from Rothschild's Bank of England. Interesting?
Very interesting.
So the Bilderberg group, or whatever you want to call them, had been at it for a long time. And I might add you of something else, of a group-based meeting they had of the so-called Bilderberg in New Jersey. I guess it was in Trenton. Guess who was number 121? None other than Hillary. And she's another hypocrite. She pretends to be for the little man, but she's not. She and Bill Clinton were tending their own nest. They even took silverware from the White House when they left. Did you know that?
No, I didn't. I didn't know that.
See, these are the things a lot of people don't know because they don't read. They get distracted by stuff like this pathetic Miss Shulko. Sometimes you just gotta take a big breath and realize she's wasting her time, maybe even contributed to failure to find the serial killer who was responsible for Ms. Rothschild and others. There were some radio programs on serial killers. Quite popular. 30 deaths on one of the late-night performances. I'm not interested in criminality. I'm a trauma surgeon and a WWD disabled veteran, and I've had some interesting positions and made some very interesting connections over the years.
No, it sounds like...
For which I'm grateful for having done this. But I haven't followed up with any prosecution of Miss Shulko because I think she's a pathetic result of dirty college politics.
I see.
I gave you some interesting things because remember the name of the chief of surgery. He was all gray-haired now, but Kararaya was certainly there. He was a string flower. He was pushing this new cancer drink, Black Flora Uroskel, and his henchman, Macman, who was a exploitation there. Big example of a hangers-on he was doing whatever kind of work he could exalt position to Dr. Kararaya. That's a professor of surgery, which came after Dr. Hickey. Both those were screwing up in the operating room. And that just goes to show off because he was an ingrown product of the residency program at Wisconsin. And he made some comments about how I didn't close the belly the same as you. Well, hell, I had surgeons who put him in shadows, some of the best in the country. At Bellevue, Dr. Emma Homan, who took his own residency staff into combat with him. When he was in combat there, I was slugging in the mud with people from the 100th Division, 399 Infantry. I was a heavy weapon machine gunner with a Brownie water-cool machine gun. I got frostbite putting antifreeze into my Brownie water-cool machine gun, carrying a 56-pound rock, track rocks, which is the job of the number one gunner. The only trouble is that it's too heavy. That's 50-odd pounds for the barrel without the water in it. But that was a marvelous shooting gun. You could put 3 shots in triple stock if you're left-handed. Pull your finger off the trigger and you get 3 shots interplay at 600 meters. Now that's shooting, like through the eye of a needle. But the only people I've ever killed or might have killed were wearing the opposite uniform. And I never had any interest in teenagers, and they were just not interesting. They were boring.
Christine Rothschild was stabbed 14 times. Do you have any idea what would compel a person to stab a person 14 times?
Well, maybe she refused some boy back in high school or something, and he took it out on her. Sounds like that's an act of rage. You would really have had to have some personal relations to make 1 or 2 stabs, but 14. That's an act of rage, wouldn't you say? You don't have to have a PhD in psychology to figure that one.
She also had her gloves shoved down her throat. I was wondering if you had any opinions about that.
Her gloves?
That's right.
Hand gloves?
Yes.
That's bizarre. What is that supposed to mean? That she talks too much, or tells people the wrong thing, or exposed him? Maybe she had an aborted sexual venture with a guy and she made fun of him, and maybe he couldn't get an erection at the proper moment. You could run wild with your imagination on that one. That's pretty wild.
One of the hypotheses that I've proposed is that maybe she was begging for her life when she was being murdered. And that was a little bit overwhelming for the murderer, so it was like an act of rage within that act of rage.
I don't think so. I think begging for her life, that's a symbolism I think you take too far. I think we have someone here who's got it in for women, or maybe she further antagonized him. I don't know, I never met the girl. I don't even know what she looks like. I never met Miss Schulko, if that's her maiden name. I don't know if that's her married name. So I have no idea. I never studied criminal law. My mom was a professor of law at the University of Copenhagen. My dad was a physics student who had another Neil, a classmate at the University of Copenhagen named Neil Bohr. I've seen some of my dad's archives to notes from Neil, and I originally spoke the King's English, because that's what my mother spoke. But anyway, my dad changed his major from physics to medicine and shipped across the country, stopped in Berkeley to see my uncle Sulfus, who was a professor of engineering at Ann Arbor, one of the founders of the American Concrete Institute. And he went to the Parnassus Street Medical Center at University of California in San Francisco. That's how I got here. I'm a second-generation Berkeley-ager, otherwise known as Berserk Ely. That's according to my Stanford friends. They always had jokes about the Stanford and Berkeley, but I guess you don't.
Well, like I hear a couple every once in a while. But,
Well, there's no reason having this one paired off against that one. UCLA versus UC, so on and so forth.
I mean, I can only imagine. Can you tell me where you were living in 1976?
1976? You mean in Madison?
Were you living in Madison, Wisconsin in 1976?
I don't remember that clearly, but that's 44 years ago. I have one thing in mind. I just finished my chief residency and getting back into the mission field in Africa. And I got into that mission field sort of by accident, and I was an engineering student before. And then I was going into Air Force headquarters as acting sergeant major off the Air Force. Captain Arnold Paris and the early field. And one of the other sergeants invited me to a Christmas service in Hucksuck McCugal Cathedral in Paris, and I was bomb Lutheran into the Evangelical Lutheran Church. But they were Catholic, of course, but the message off the bishop at the Christmas services really got through to me, and I said, well, maybe I should try medicine. So I started taking biological courses when I went back to UCLA after the war. That's how that started. And my friend there was Sergeant Prank Zimonetti. He was a religious Catholic boy in the finance department of Air Force headquarters in the patrolling the fields in Paris and Pitoir, and from an old Italian family. He retired as a bank president in Grand Junction, Colorado, and I went to see him several times. That's how I got, not sidetracked, but I got diverted into the mission field as a surgeon. It was a sermon, "Have you done unto you at least what you have done unto me?" And that was enough for me. I was also a ghetto doctor in charge of one of the biggest clinics in Brooklyn, Gates Bushwick. I had a Catholic doctor surgeon also who was my associate there. We had a dozen doctors. Gates Bushwick is one of the biggest clinics we have, over 100,000 patients in our file. And then when my mom got a scratch on her gold Cadillac, how harsh, and she didn't want to drive anymore. So I had to give away my practice so I could get a private clinic in Mastiff, Queens, which I took over from Dr. Jacobson when he passed on. I actually had 3 offices in New York, including Stratford, 4 hospitals. I was a busy boy. Across the street, over the railroad tracks, was the Golden Dragon, where I went for my evening run and all the vampires and werewolves and stuff came out. I call them junkies. When I was late for the meeting, the monthly meeting of the Public Health Committee, they would say, "Oh dear, we've seen the last of Dr. J," but I would show up. I kept turning up for the meetings and so forth. Even though we were yearly losing doctors to the knife and gun club, it was a dangerous area.
Yeah, it sounds like a very dangerous area.
But there I was for years, until my mom needed me and I gave away my practice so people could take care of the patients. Didn't sell it, I just gave it away. Said, "Here you are, take good care," and then I was never in residence in New York. I stayed in Pennsylvania where I kept my horse.
You had a horse in Pennsylvania?
Yeah, I got him off the track in New York. He was a Banniston Meadower, Triple Crown winner.
That's very impressive.
Black, 16-hand stallion. He was my real friend. I used to go down there on weekends. Singles Country Club, which was in Pennsylvania, Willow Springs, Pickering Hunts Club. I used to ride him during fox hunts, chasing them on weekends. You know, chasing foxes. In fact, we chased all the foxes out, so we had to import some more.
Well, Mr. Jorgensen, I was wondering if the name Deborah Bennett meant anything to you.
No, that's not ringing a bell. The only girl I remember, she was not a girl. She was a woman, very fine lady. Ramara Crass was a philosophy student, a graduate student. And in other words, the so-called hippie twins, a couple of graduate students, nursing, graduate in nursing, they sort of adopted me, I guess. I don't know why. But they'd come over, and I guess it was that fatal night they were over at my place, which is across the street, maybe a little bit to the west from the hospital entrance. And then to the east a little bit was a store, was a restaurant, and a lot of people sort of congregated there. It was nice to have coffee and a hamburger. Anyways, they were there. They fantasized themselves as being hippies, nursing hippies. They were very respectable persons from good families and all that, and getting their bachelor's degrees in nursing from the University of Wisconsin. And they were over at my place, socializing and eating coffee and talking, and I reminded them that it was getting close to lockup time. And I drove them back to their place, east on the main boulevard, between my one level, a bunch of apartments, a residence, and a hospital to the east, several blocks to the accommodations where they lived. And I just pulled down the wrong side of the street, no traffic, and then made a U-turn, parked, and in our parking lot. So, there was a lot of people watching television. The late news, I thought I was pretty well covered during the hours of interest. There's 2 nurse witnesses and the medical residents there. So what about this vindictive surgery professor who wanted to throw mud in my direction because I exposed him for being a lazy, arrogant bum that he was? That's the problem with doctors today. They're not interested. They're not with a conscience anymore. They forget obligations imposed by Cassiopoulos, the godfather of medicine. In fact, I contributed money from my own investments when I was an undergraduate at UCLA. I had a dive boat, and I used to dive for this underwater constructions, underwater demolition, and that was a hobby I had, underwater medicine. I was a member of the Undersea Medical Society. That's one of the reasons why I was a consultant for Chief Kukenboak on a marine search expedition for Mozambique for Witwatersrand University in Johannesburg. We were there for 3 months, hunting goiter in Mozambique area of Porto Analia, which was fish breeding grounds in the Indian Ocean near the northern rim of Chicago, near the Mozambique, which by the way was having a communist rebellion at the time. That's probably not news to you. You've probably heard about that.
Did you ever move back to Wisconsin, to Madison even?
Never. The only interest I had there was to get my chief surgery residency, fulfill my board eligibility for the Board of Surgeons. And the only reason it wasn't working out there was because of the political unrest I encountered, and I got my chief residency in New York. Madison, Wisconsin thought the sun didn't set without Wisconsin, and I beg to differ.
About 35 years ago, a couple police came to question you, and you were ill at the time.
That was not ill. I contacted my friends in the state of New York, and these police officers were probably sent on their way back to the Midwest without a choice. Farewell party type of thing. Get gone, or else face prosecution.
Okay. Do you believe these capital city murders were connected?
What are the capital city murders? I don't know this local stuff. I had no interest in Wisconsin. I was just interested in getting my chief surgery residency, and I got overwhelmed by the local hassles there, and I left. And good riddance. All your backbiting little hassles going on and your incompetent handling of serial killer and God knows what else. You should have taken some officer from New Orleans or New York or San Francisco or something where they handle real crime instead of this, whatever you call it, police in Madison.
Okay, well, I really appreciate your time today, and I have one last question for you. Did you murder Christine Rothschild?
I never even knew her. I have no reason to kill her or any other teenager. I had no interest. You'd have to be in a state of frag in order to make 15 or 20, or what did you tell me stab wounds it was?
It was 14 stab wounds.
14. Well, if it's 5 or 10 or 20, it's still too many. One good thrust would do the job, if you had the knowledge of anatomy to do it, you know? It doesn't take that much knowledge. Any good swordsman knows where to find a place.
She was stabbed with a medical tool, and that just makes me curious if maybe you have some suspicions as to who might
Medical tool? You mean like a Humvee knife or something?
Yeah, like a scalpel?
An amputation knife? My own attitude was to try and avoid an amputation knife by doing vascular grafts. It preserves perfusion of blood to the limb and saves the limb. This I learned from my chief at Bellevue, where Dr. Neville Homan took his hole and stabbed during combat during the Central European campaign. Battle off the bulge, they call it. And he was doing vascular grafts operating blood floor, using veins for his artillery wounds or whatever else you could interrupt circulation and saving legs that way.
That's very interesting.
That's my chief of surgery at Bellevue, Dr. Homan. Great surgeon. Hell of a lot better surgeon than that Kerorian in Wisconsin, and a number of other chief of surgery at other places that I knew. The great professor from the Middleton School and Baltimore, John Hopkins, which many arguably say was the head of the surgery, even on the West Coast. Actually, first surgeon and chief at the UCLA was a plastic surgery professor before he came to UCLA in the 50s. He started there about the time I started medical school, a level under which, incidentally, was a religious-motivated school.
No kidding. So you had no contact with a woman who you are the prime suspect in the murder of?
Never did.
This
was all a vindictive gesture by a surgery member because I exposed him for what he was, a lack of conscience. And that's the reason results in the negligent death of a patient.
And that's the reason you moved out of Madison soon after.
I had been offered residency in other departments. I could also have gotten into their kidney transplant program, which was very lucrative. You know how many kidneys were being transplanted?
No, I do not.
There was a long backlist waiting for a kidney with the dialysis machines. It was a hell of a way to live. But I wasn't interested in that. I wanted to get back into the mission field. But for that, I needed a chief residency in general surgery, not in kidney transplants or plastic surgery or any other opportunity in Wisconsin. But I wasn't interested. It didn't serve my purposes. People never get that through their damn heads. What's so great about Wisconsin? It's the nation's icebox. Well, I had a lot of fellow Scandinavians there. So what? Actually, I have more friends with Mexicans than I did with the Scandinavians. My first real girlfriend was a 19-year-old Mexican lady. She was a refugee from the communist Venezuela in Mexico. They were ranchers across. They ran. Amalia was staying with her cousin, Pedro Vorez, who I used to run around the track with growing up. I grew up to 6 foot and 15-year-old. Blonde, 15-year-old, looked pretty good to a pretty Mexican girl. Well, I learned the value of older women. I was 15, she was 19, she was no child. Wonderful family, actually. Big happy family in San Fernando.
Well, Dr. Jorgensen, I just have to ask you one more time. Why did you never clear your name for this murder with this woman you had absolutely no contact with?
Why should I bother?
Well, that's a pretty heavy,
Well, I didn't find out until I got a letter from Miss Schulko that they're actually a surgery department member who put a shadow on me. I got that in her last letter. Want me to read it to you?
Sure. Yes, please.
I knew who the Rothschild family were. I used to go flying with Victor Rothschild when we were students at Berkeley. Then he suddenly dropped out, and I found out it was because he had an attack of malaria. This is not the latest letter, just hold on.
Thank you.
Interesting line of people. Dr. Hickey, Marvin Chienberg, the witness to Dr. Hickey's goofing on the operating table, Dr. Marquine and Dr. Carreri, all these campus people, and the hippie nurse twins. They were funny. They weren't really good hippies. They were not genuine hippies. They were not smoking pot. They were not doing all sorts of weird counterculture things. That incident in Woodstock. I had a girlfriend in New York from the Chan clan, professor of computer sciences at the University of Colorado. Anyway, greetings from Texas. It's in neat printed handwriting. You came up in conversation the other day. Remember you worked at University Wisconsin-Madison University Hospital in the 68. Anyways, it was your supervisor who turned in your name to Chief Ralph Hansen off the UW campus. You are a suspect in Christine Rothschild's murder on May 26, 1968. I'm sure you recall Chief Hansen sent 2 detectives to speak with you after you fled Madison. I was not fleeing, I was seeking my chief residency. If you ever want to chat about an old UW Badger, I didn't even know the name was Badger. I wasn't even interested in football. At Berkeley, I was in International House next to the stadium. You think I ever saw a football game when I was going to Berkeley? No, I went stock fishing or deer hunting. Anyways, Badger Day, call collect. It would be interesting to reminisce since we have friends in common. I don't know any friends we have in common. She's deluded, that poor soul. Happy Valentine's Day. Ha, what a joke.
Did she send you that letter this year?
Posted 16 February 2011.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for reading that to me. I think that's going to add a pretty interesting dimension to this report.
What are you writing a report for?
It's just a cultural studies class. I chose to do an assignment on a serial killer, and this one was just one of the first names which came up when I did a search for it, so I figured I'd go with this.
You could also, that Christine's case was never solved, and these jerks muddling things up with their incompetence, they were responsible in the case, never getting solved with misdirecting their efforts.
Yeah, I have read that. I have that the police were pretty incompetent in terms of this case, so...
And there was also this nastiness of having respect for doctors who didn't deserve their respect. If you have a doctor who deserves respect, that, like some of the missionaries in Africa. Name one. Can you name a good missionary in Africa? A famous missionary doctor from the Congo?
I can't say I'm familiar.
Albert Schweitzer. Did you know that he was my pen pal, among others?
Was he really?
He invited me. He invited me to serve with him, but unfortunately, death took him from us. Later on, I met his successor. The successor was a nice young doctor from Belgium, but he couldn't do an organ recital and make $20,000. So La Barona was in financial straits because it didn't have the financial wherewithal.
Well, thank you so much for your help and your time this afternoon.
Well, what do you think about somebody like this patient, actually? She's not my patient, this Schulko person. What can be done? She's obviously sick. You know what? As a psychiatrist, I studied psychiatry, but I do not have the patience to be a psychiatrist. I know plenty about it. You have to deal with all kinds of stuff. This is something I choose not to.
I hope she can get the help she needs.
Don't bet on it. Because now it's a matter of her trying to justify herself, and that not to happen.
You don't think she's made a very convincing case, then?
She has just got a chronic case of obsessive neurosis.
Well...
She can't quite solve it. She may have contributed to the failure to solve it, the justice on the case off this 16-year-old girl who was probably a pretty bright girl, but she may have crossed somebody in the wrong way, and these things happen.
All right, then. Well, have a great afternoon, and thank you again for your time.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
We know when I had my answer for my last question, I don't want to be on the phone with you for another hour because you make me very uncomfortable and you're very, obviously very unwell, so. But also, like, lonely old guy, right? Part of it is this need narcissists to just, like, charm everyone and talk about how wonderful they are, and then the other is just this very isolated old man who, in whatever strange way, like, grateful to have someone to talk to for an hour on a weekday afternoon.
Arguing with strangers on the internet, not going out today because I'm feeling too upset.
I remember I was living with like a good family friend at the time, and after I'd done the interview, we were on the phone for just under an hour. I was like, hey, I'm pretty sure I interviewed a serial killer today. And she was like, here? At my house? And I'm like, no, Mimi, no, of course not.
Arguing with strangers on the internet, not going out today because I'm feeling too upset. Arguing with strangers on the internet, and I'm winning, and I'm winning.
When Christine Rothschild walked out of Anne Emery Hall on the morning of May 26, 1968, she embarked on a morning walk that was never completed. It was interrupted. In some ways, it feels like the final chapter of the story of Chris's life and death is also unfinished and incomplete. And that, despite Linda Schulkel's decades-long quest to get answers, there are still things we would like to know. And I don't know about you, but I feel like somewhere, in some other dimension, maybe in heaven, Christine Rothschild is still out there under the street lamps and morning mist, walking and waiting for us to put the pieces together. Some answers lie in a police file in Madison, Wisconsin. I requested an interview with UWPD to ask them about the status of the case in hopes of getting some answers to specific questions. And I also asked if I could review the police file. I was declined because they say the case is still open and active and they can't tell us anything all these 56 years later. And I'm not alone. Anna Hansen at the Wisconsin State Journal has had the same frustrating experience.
We have actually worked with a Freedom of Information Act lawyer, and we drafted up a letter sort of bringing in those Freedom of Information statutes in the Wisconsin legislature, and sort of noting that, that's not really a legally valid answer of we can't give you anything at all because of this open investigation. And there is that argument that law enforcement often employs that, any information could jeopardize the case. And of course, there is merit to that. But at the same time, as you mentioned, this case is, more than 50 years old. That we, sent that letter basically saying, that doesn't necessarily hold up. And they said that their response was that it would be an undue burden to get me those reports because it's something like 12,000 pages and, it'd be a lot. And so I then asked for an inventory list of the documents and reports that they have so that I could request specific ones. And it wouldn't be an undue burden to get, instead of all 12,000 pages to request this, this, and this. And my most recent feedback on that was them saying, we don't have an inventory list and we do not have to make one by law. So, I was speaking to that same lawyer the other day, and he said, that definitely is a story in and of itself that, since 1968, they've been working on this case and no inventory list exists. So there's the question of how they keep things organized with, I can't imagine how many, 12,000 pages of. So that's going to be part of the story for sure.
For now, this is the last episode of Season 10, but if there are any updates or if we get access to that police file, you can expect some update episodes. Meanwhile, we can find some solace and comfort in the many inspirational elements of this story, including the beauty of friendship, devotion, love, and the pursuit of healing. Because answers or no answers, good things have come from Linda's work. After the murder of her dorm mate, Sarah Surratt could not return to UW. She transferred to another school, and after college became a public defender.
I put bad experiences in a box in my head, and as time goes by, you close the lid, and you just don't open that lid very often as time goes by. And that lid was closed for a really, really long time until I heard from Linda some years ago. And, then you open the lid, and it actually was really good for me when Linda contacted me, and I was able to talk about it and express some things and some emotions that I think I needed to get out. I've had so many experiences since then, especially going into criminal law, and I've defended so many murders. And it's interesting because the question that everybody always has with murder is why? Why? And I've come to the conclusion that a lot of times there's just no answer. There is no why. It's just something that happened at the moment, a bad decision, a moment of anger, and there was a weapon there. And a lot of times there is no why.
I will let Dr. Lou Bernhard express what I imagine many of you are already thinking and feeling.
Without compromise, Linda Schilkel should be recognized for her intense love of Christine, her friendship, and doing what she felt was right. And if she didn't pursue this, and I don't know The only time I really met Linda was at the memorial. I don't know her, her social situation, their family. But it must have been at a great cost to pursue this. She really deserves a lot of credit.
In fact, Linda did not set out on this quest with the goal of someday writing a book about it. On the contrary, the book, it turns out, was a type of last straw for her.
My reason for writing the book was not to tell the world Chris's story. My reason for writing the book was so that I call them the players in Chris's death and investigation and so forth are properly identified, and they are accountable to themselves, not to the world necessarily, but to themselves for the role they played in frustrating the case so that it still remains cold today as far as its status. That was my last straw, basically, in what I had to do to kind of put the final chapter into the life of the problem. I'm still active. Anything I read about Chris or people write, I'm still responsive to it and so forth. But that was my own personal dedication to Chris. The story will be told as accurately, and the players fully identified, and their roles fully identified to the best of my ability after all these years of doing my very best research to find the truth.
And about that book, there is a lot in there that we were simply unable to get to in this podcast. I highly recommend that you order Linda's Kindle book, Murder on the 56th Day. You can get it on Amazon or use the links in the show notes. That's Murder on the 56th Day by Linda Schulko. Schulko is spelled Schulko. Linda donates the proceeds from the book to charity. As I said, this is the last scheduled episode of You Killed Chris, but stay on the lookout for update episodes down the road. You have been listening to You Killed Chris, A Friend's Fight for Justice. A special thanks to Mari Zoerb Hansen for all her amazing help on this season, and thanks to everyone who took time out to share their memories. And to Kevin Damask, his book is titled Cold, The Unsolved Murders of 7 Young Women. Jill Clare's punk rock band is named Mall Crimes, but Mall is spelled M-V-L-L, Mall Crimes. I put a link to their work in the show notes. My name is James Woolner, and this is Dakota Spotlight. Learn more about this show and the full 10 seasons ready to be binged at my website, dakotaspotlight.com.